So just a couple notes. So one, I had a couple videos I wanted to show you, but they couldn't get the sound to work. So I'm just going to summarize them for you. I think some of you all will already know exactly what I'm talking about anyway. But then I also wanted to give a quick content warning. So towards the end of my talk, the topic evolves, and I'm going to be talking about sexual violence. I have a couple writers in particular who recount specific acts of sexual violence, and I'll be talking about rape scripts. So just wanted to warn everybody because you might not gather that from my title alone. So why a talk on politeness? So first I want to say this is not my research area. I'm not a communications expert, and I'm not a sociolinguist. But I do teach about these issues within women's studies classes and as part of an interdisciplinary approach to issues of gender roles, gender stereotypes, and gender socialization. One area I am an expert on is the area of what we call reception studies, particularly the reception of women's writing within patriarchal contexts. In many ways, when you're studying the reception of women's writing, say when you're looking at book reviews about the quality of a novel written by a woman, you are in fact studying the history of impolite, if not hostile, judgments of value. So I do bring that kind of context or background to the talk today. And just as I ask my students to do in my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies classes, I also love to collect cultural artifacts about gender and identity. That is, examples of text and images that surround us on a daily basis, and through subtle and not so subtle messaging, instruct us on how to perform gender. And let's just say it's been an interesting year for artifact collection. 2017 and 2018 thus far have been really interesting years for thinking in particular about impoliteness. Not just because Donald Trump's presidency has framed the very nature of presidential and civil discourse for us, but because of things that have been going around going on culturally in a much more broader sense. So if we're thinking in terms specifically about gender and politeness, there are a couple moments in particular that stand out. And perhaps none more so than the moment in February 2017 when Senator Elizabeth Warren was effectively muzzled by Senate Republicans during the floor debate about Jeff Sessions' nomination to the position of Attorney General. And so one of the videos I had wanted to show you was that actual moment when she's giving her speech, and Mitch McConnell was actually interrupting her and cutting her off. And it's an interesting moment in terms of the dynamic, but you probably have seen it or you know about it. But here's what exactly happened. So as Warren is attempting to read from a 30-year-old letter written by Coretta Scott King on the occasion of Jeff Sessions' nomination to serve as a federal court judge in Alabama, a letter that criticized his record on African-American voter rights as well as his, quote, temperament, fairness, and judgment, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell cut her off and initiated a vote that would prevent her from speaking any further on the Senate floor about Sessions' nomination. To do so, he evoked Senate Rule 19, a rarely enforced rule that states, quote, no senator in debate shall directly or indirectly, by any form of words, impute to another senator or to other senators any conduct or motive unworthy or unbecoming a senator. So several points are really worth emphasizing about this particular incident. One is the history of the rule. It's actually a really fascinating history. So according to the coverage at the time by the Washington Post, the rule originates from an incident in 1902 that led to a fist fight, interestingly enough, between two senators of the same party following exchange of accusations about, quote, treachery and lying. Since then, throughout its now century-plus existence, it has rarely been used. Washington Post reports finding just one incident, and it didn't even lead to an actual vote. Just the sheer mention of Rule 19 was enough, apparently, to end the name-calling at that moment. So another thing that's really interesting about this incident with Elizabeth Warren is the fact that during the following day, other senators, all of them men, read from the same Coretta Scott King letter on the Senate floor without interruption or objection, and they were subsequently described in various media reports as demonstrating, in the words of one, a renewed swagger. And I find that word swagger there really fascinating. The third point that's worth emphasizing about this moment is, of course, McConnell's now infamous explanation on the Senate floor for why he called Senator Elizabeth Warren to, quote, order. He says, Senator Warren was giving a lengthy speech. She had appeared to violate the rule. She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted. The rapidity with which she persisted trended on social media and appeared on T-shirts and feminist-minded Etsy stores demonstrates the degree to which what happened to Warren resonated with women. The interruption, the accusation that she was out of order in her criticism and in the tone of her criticism, the assertion that she was being unreasonable in the face of you would think, right, implied reasonable explanation given by McConnell, and the relegation to a state of silence. All of that hit home for many women. Every woman who has ever had her impoliteness regulated understood the significance of that moment on the Senate floor. The fourth thing I want to point out about this particular moment with Elizabeth Warren is that in the interviews that followed, Warren refused to call the actions of McConnell and the Senate Republicans sexist, despite continual prodding by journalists to do so. And that, to me, really underscores how far we have to go towards a real understanding of the nature of such acts of regulating women's politeness. So interestingly, Jeff Sessions' confirmation hearings also brought us another moment to think about in terms of messages of gender and politeness. Let's see here. This one came about when Desiree Feruz, who you see in the pictures here, an activist with the anti-war organization Code Pink, was in the audience at the hearing at Jeff Sessions' hearing, and she laughed involuntarily in response to a senator's statement that Jeff Sessions had, quote, a, quote, extensive record of treating all Americans equally under the law. Feruz herself describes her laugh as, quote, more of a chortle of disdain, and notes that at no time had anyone warned those in attendance that they would be out of order if they laughed. In May 2017, she was convicted on a misdemeanor charge of disorderly conduct and parading and demonstrating on Capitol grounds. That verdict was later overturned by the Superior Court judge on the grounds that laughter alone wasn't sufficient cause for conviction. Nevertheless, a retrial for the charges was still set for November 2017. But fortunately, before that could take place, the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C. decided to dismiss the case, I think probably because it had gotten a lot of bad publicity at that stage. But, you know, it's great for Feruz that her charges were dismissed, but it's totally unsatisfying for those of us who wanted to see how a judge would finally adjudicate what counts as good behavior, particularly for a woman, particularly for an angry woman. So the third moment I want to highlight today is a quite recent one. And if you follow feminist social media, you're probably familiar with it. If you don't, then it might not have shown up on your radar at all. Originally reported by Fox 13 News in Utah, the situation involves a Valentine's Day school dance in Canesville, Utah, and a rule supported by the school district that states that students in this particular case, we're talking about 11 and 12-year-olds, are not allowed to decline, that is to say no, to any invitation they receive to dance at the school dance. Again, I had a quick news clip that I wanted to show you, but I'll just quickly summarize. In the news coverage, there's one mother in particular who tried to offer resistance to this rule. And in fact, her daughter comes home from school telling her this, and she's like, "You've misunderstood. There's no way," right? But it turns out it is in fact true. And even after media coverage, the school did not back down. This rule still exists. So if you are in fact asked to dance at this Valentine's Day school dance, you're not allowed to say no. We'll talk about, I think you'll begin to see the significance of that rule as we move along in the talk here. Okay, and so then the last instance from recent history that I want to talk about is actually one that just happened a couple weeks ago and that went viral on social media when Howard University student Kendall Hall captured and shared her email exchange with the university president at Howard over an online glitch that left some students without campus housing for the following fall semester. So Hall sent an email to President Wayne Frederick explaining the situation and asking him to advise the students who'd been shut out of campus housing on what they were supposed to do. And it might be hard to see here. It's a little bit blurry, the smaller text. But so here's her email to the president, and then here's his response. She's captured both and put them into a tweet. And one of the reasons this email exchange goes viral is because of the astonishing response that she gets from the president, right? And I will say I've read this email several times. There's nothing in her tone that suggests that she's at all being anything but polite. She is critical, but even in that, she is polite in her criticism. So what are we talking about when we talk about politeness? I think we all know, right? We all have a basic understanding of what politeness means. But I would like to say today that I think it's worth thinking a little bit about the very basic definitions of the word with a bit more self-consciousness than we might ordinarily bring to the word. So I just did a quick Google search. And so here are some, very common definitions. So Google Dictionary defines it as behavior that is respectful and considerate of other people. Dictionary.com says it's showing good manners towards others, as in behavior, speech, etc., to be courteous, to be civil. Merriam-Webster, speech or behavior that is a sign of good breeding. The Cambridge Dictionary, behaving in a way that is socially correct and shows respect for other people's feelings. And never cite Wikipedia in your paper for your professor, but I found this sentence from Wikipedia so relevant to what I want to talk about today. So according to Wikipedia, the goal of politeness is to make all the parties relaxed and comfortable with one another. And that phrase, comfortable, here is really fascinating to me, and it's going to come back into my talk here later as well. So the gendered nature of expectations for politeness is well documented. Studies exploring the differences between how women and men speak and how that speech is received by the listener are many, and such scholarship has played an important role in the body of feminist research that emerged out of the 1970s women's movements, and particularly this scholarship's efforts to both recover the experience of women and to bring new perspectives to the question of gender differences. I'm not going to review or go into that history here, both because of time constraints and also I'm not a sociolinguist, so that's not really my area of expertise. I want instead to assume that as we've seen in the examples I've shared today, women are indeed policed for impoliteness in ways men are not. And once we assume that, then we can move on to what, for me, are the more interesting questions. So first, what work does the policing of impoliteness do? especially in the context of global gender inequality. And there's a lot of feminist writing that helps us answer this question, and some of it takes place in some rather surprising contexts. So in a 1931 speech to the London National Society for Women's Service, British author Virginia Woolf tells a story about her own experiences reviewing a novel by a famous man that offers us one of the most well-known examinations of politeness by a feminist we have. She describes the experience this way, and please bear with me. I'm going to read a fair amount from her text to you, in part because I'm going to guess you're not familiar with it, having maybe not encountered much Virginia Woolf in your classes, but also because it's really hard to excerpt it, because it's such a rich, long description of the experience that she has as a woman writer. So here's what she says. While I was writing this review, I discovered that if I were going to review books, I should need to do battle with a certain phantom. And the phantom was a woman. And when I came to know her better, I called her after the heroine of a famous poem, The Angel in the House. It was she who used to come between me and my paper when I was writing reviews. It was she who bothered me and wasted my time and so tormented me that I had to kill her. You who come of a younger and happier generation may not have heard of her. You may not know what I mean by the angel in the house. I will describe her as shortly as I can. She was intensely sympathetic. She was intensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. If there was chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draft, she sat in it. In short, she was so constituted that she never had a mind or a wish of her own, but preferred to sympathize always with the minds and wishes of others. Above all, I need not say it, she was pure. And when I came to write, I encountered her with the very first words. The shadow of her wings fell on my page. I heard the rustling of her skirts in the room. Directly, that is to say, I took my pen in my hand to review the novel by a famous man. She slipped behind me and whispered, "My dear, you are a young woman. You are writing about a book that has been written by a man. Be sympathetic, be tender, flatter, deceive. Use all the arts and wiles of your sex. Never let anybody guess that you have a mind of your own. Above all, be pure." And she made as if to guide my pen. I now record the one act for which I take some credit to myself, though the credit rightly belongs to some excellent ancestors of mine who left me a certain sum of money. That's a long story, I can't go into it now, but she says, I turned upon her and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. My excuse, if I were to be had up in any court of law, would be that I acted in self-defense. Had I not killed her, she would have killed me. She would have plucked the heart out of my writing. For as I found directly I put pen to paper, you cannot review even a novel without having a mind of your own, without expressing what you think to be the truth about human relations, morality, sex. And all these questions, according to the angel in the house, cannot be dealt with freely and openly by women. They must charm, they must conciliate. They must, to put it bluntly, tell lies if they are to succeed. Thus, whenever I felt the shadow of her wing or the radiance of her halo upon my page, I took the ink pot and I flung it at her. She died hard. She was always creeping back when I thought I had dispatched her. Though I flatter myself that I killed her in the end, the struggle was severe. It took much time that had better have been spent upon learning Greek grammar or in roaming the world in search of adventures. But it was a real experience. It was an experience that was found to befall women writers at that time. Killing the angel in the house was part of the occupation of a woman writer. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here about the origins of the angel in the house. It's important to understanding the passage I just read that you know her reference. So she's referring in particular to the famous poem by Coventry Patmore called The Angel in the House, first published in 1854, and wildly popular in the United States and in England, all the way up through the early 20th century, in fact. The image of the angel in the house would come in the decades following the publication of Patmore's poem to represent ideal Victorian womanhood. Well, let's say white middle-class womanhood anyway. Womanhood defined through the domestic roles of wife and mother and through the values of submissiveness and self-sacrifice. In a fascinating and unexpected twist, Woolf's identification of the angel and her attempts to dispatch her with an ink pot has served as a tool for others wishing to make sense of this image of feminine politeness, decorum, submissiveness in very different contexts. So in a 2004 essay entitled "Betrayed by the Angel: What Happens When Violence Knocks and Politeness Answers," Deborah Ann Davis uses Woolf's own battle with the phantom angel to understand a trajectory of events in her own life. She begins her essay by recounting an episode of bullying she experienced as a child in the 3rd grade. She describes a boy named Hank who would jab his pencil into her arm several times a day. One day, when she decides she cannot endure the bullying anymore, she resolves to tell her teacher. The teacher replies to her, "You go back to your seat and you tell me if he ever does it again." Davis describes her own reaction at the time this way: "I never could work up the nerve again to walk the 15 feet to the big desk and blurt out the nature of the boy's crime. Always he pokes me. I continued going home each day with pencil wounds. The problem, I think, was that I simply wasn't mad at him. When I went to tell the teacher, my voice wasn't loud in a burst of righteous anger. It was demure. I didn't want to bother her. Maybe I didn't want to see Hank punished. Maybe I didn't think I deserved not to be hurt." Flash forward, and Davis is now 25 years old, alone in her apartment, when there comes a knock at her door. When she opens the door, she sees the face of a stranger who scares her. She says, "My first impulse is to shut the door, but I stop myself. You can't do something like that. It's rude." When the man pushes his way into her apartment and shoves her against the wall, Davis decides maybe now it's okay to be rude back. So she tells us, "I want to open the door and shove him outside and then slam the door in his face, rude or not. I don't care. But frankly, I don't push him aside with much determination. I've made the mental choice to be rude, but I haven't been able to muster the physical bluntness the act requires. Or maybe I realize the game is already lost. He's stronger than I am, I assume, as men have always been stronger. I have no real chance of pushing him aside. No real chance of it unless I am very angry. And I'm not very angry. I'm a little bit angry. But despite the fact that I didn't shove with much force, he is angry with me. I don't know why. It's because I've been, she says, I know why. It's because I've been rude to him. He is insulted. I am a bit ashamed." She says, "We fall into our roles quite easily. Two people who have never met each other, two people raised in the same culture, a man and a woman, as it turns out, a rapist and his victim." The rest of Davis's essay describes the rape itself, cataloging the interactions between Davis and her rapist and the generally submissive role she plays throughout. It is later on, when she attempts to write about the rape, that Davis finds herself remembering Virginia Woolf's angel, an angel that hovers over Davis as she attempts to give an account of the events in writing, and that clearly hovers over her as she tries in her daily life to resist an impulse towards politeness, towards submissiveness. 10 years later, 10 years after her rape, we learn, and Davis still struggles to feel entitled to be rude to strangers who compliment her or approach her with flirtatious interest. Despite her best efforts to kill the angel, she's left wondering, What I want to know is this, is if I'm ever physically attacked again, will I fight to save myself? When I teach Davis's essay in my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies course, it generates really strong reactions, and for good reason. It's easy to mistake Davis's story as one of self-incrimination, of self-blame. But I would argue Davis frames her rape through the bullying incident by Hank in 3rd grade and through Virginia Woolf because it's culture she wishes to indict. A culture that here takes the shape of pernicious messaging that conflates being a girl or a woman with being polite, with the expectations that to be a girl or a woman is to be cooperative, it is to be pleasing to others, it is to be nice. A culture that constitutes women as always already powerless victims. In a 1992 essay that theorizes rape culture through a post-structuralist lens, the writer Sharon Marcus gives a term for this phenomenon. She calls it the rape script. Describing what we might now call rape culture, Marcus asks her readers to consider, quote, how the violence of rape is enabled by narratives, complexes, and institutions which derive their strength not from outright, immutable, unbeatable force, but rather from their power to structure our lives as imposing cultural scripts. Echoing Davis's point about rape, Marcus writes, the rape script takes its form from what I will call a gendered grammar of violence, where grammar means the rules and structures which assign people to positions within a script. The gendered grammar of violence predicates men as objects of violence and the operators of its tools, and predicates women as the objects of violence and subjects of fear. The rape script, she argues, also suggests that social structures inscribe on men's and women's embodied selves and psyches the misogynist inequalities which enable rape to occur. Rape script, she says, has colonized our minds and our bodies. Here's one more quick excerpt from her essay that I think is really powerful, and so I'm going to read it for you too. She says, feminist theory has widely acknowledged that when women follow social conventions, we recognize and enact our gendered selves as objects of violence. It is by now a feminist truism, but nevertheless still an important feminist truth, that the criteria of feminine beauty and worthy feminine behavior, if enacted without any modification, create a trammeled, passive person. Our culture's various techniques of feminization tend to buttress the rape script, since the femininity they induce makes a feminine woman the perfect victim of sexual aggression. For Marcus, we see this enacted in discourse about rape and rape prevention that too often goes against women's best interest in preventing rape. For example, the prescription of empathy, and maybe you've seen this in artifacts that you've noticed about rape prevention. Excuse me. So the prescription of empathy, that women should respond to rape by showing empathy to the would-be rapist, that she should make him feel like a human being. Or there's also the prescription of responsiveness, and this is all language that comes out of studies that have been done on the subject of rape. So the prescription of responsiveness, that women not take the offensive in a dialogue with a would-be rapist for fear that offending the rapist could escalate the act of violence even further. Having taught Marcus's essay dozens of times in feminist theory classes, I am intrigued both by her argument and by reactions to it. On the one hand, it's a brilliant application of post-structuralist theory. So to anyone who's ever tried to understand the identity, or the argument central to post-structuralism, that identities are discursive constructs, that language constitutes our lived reality, it offers a concrete example of how our material lives are in fact scripted, and importantly, and this is really crucial, can therefore be re-scripted, okay? On the other hand, Marcus appears to overlook the implication of her own identification of what she helpfully calls the aggregation of micro-strategies of oppression. That is to say, Marcus singles out the rape script as if it exists in isolation, as if it's the only script that needs to be interrupted in our socialization. Which is partly why I wanted to bring Sharon Marcus's and Deborah Davis's two pieces together in my talk today. Davis's recounting of her experiences of rape suggests Marcus has missed the significance of the prefix micro in this phrase here, as well as of the word aggregation. I want to suggest that a true interrogation of the micro would start with the very idea of politeness, with the ways women are held through policing and regulating actions to standards of niceness, comforting emotions, not discomforting emotions, to cooperation, and to an acquiescing passivity, and the ways that they are punished when they depart from those standards. It's the interaction of these two systems I want to suggest that represent the aggregation and the very idea of the aggregation of micro-strategies of oppression. We can see this, I think, in the last two examples I want to share. The first is a Tumblr called When Women Refuse, and you may have seen this Tumblr, that brings together stories from women whose attempts to refuse men's sexual advances led to violent reprisals. So it was actually inspired by an incident in California several years back in which a woman turned down a man's invitation to a date and he killed her. So this is the structure of it is, you know, here's how I resisted and here's the reprisal I faced. The second is a true crime podcast called My Favorite Murder that delves into murder cases narrated and explored by the two women hosts of the show who routinely draw lessons from the cases that are meant to underscore the ways politeness sets women up for violence. It's a message that one of the hosts boils down in one particular episode to the simple credo, and here's where I take my title, fuck politeness. The coexistence of these two spaces and the contrary narratives of resistance. Resistance is both the remedy to the violence and the cause of more violence. Suggests to me that we do in fact need to end politeness in our discourse about politeness. We do in fact need to drill down to expectations of politeness and our messaging and policing of that politeness as the very, very place, the beginning place where inequality can finally be ended. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Oh, yes, me, ma'am?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's
yeah,
it.
I'm Jason. So, yeah, I loved the lecture, and I'm just trying to think here. Now, I've always been one of these guys that, you know, I've generally actually been, I would say, at least half of the definition that you've talked about today. You know, I try to be agreeable. Mm-hmm. I try not to, you know, I just try to please people and be there and things like that. But I kind of wonder if maybe what would be best is if instead of, you know, policing women and all these other things, I almost wonder, you know, wouldn't it sound so easy if you could just give everybody the same conditions on what they should and shouldn't be instead of stereotyping? I mean, that sounds so easy.
So let me clarify something really important here too. Yes. I'm not suggesting we all give up on politeness.
No, I don't.
That is, yeah, because I think what I'm suggesting is that we stop policing people when they're impolite. Yeah. And particularly, yeah. I think checking. Okay, so I'll backtrack here and say that one of the inspirations for my talk is all of the stories I've heard from women over the years about how they're too angry, they've been told they're too emotional, they're told they're being too unreasonable, they're told that they can ask a question, but only if they ask it nicely, right? They're too critical, et cetera, et cetera. I hear these stories endlessly. So what I'm asking for, and by the way, those you're being too, come from both women and men. So let me be clear. Lots of people, regardless of gender, police women's politeness.
Yeah,
and some of that is the internalized messaging that we get. But I think what's really important here is all I'm asking is people hit a pause button. If your impulse is to check somebody for being too critical, too emotional, too impolite, is to check and ask yourself, if the same words were coming from a man whose authority I respect, would I have the same impulse to judge this person as being rude, or to judge this person as being not nice enough in their interrogation or their criticism? Does that help clarify?
Yeah, it does, and I guess if your answer there is yes, then there is something going on.
Yes.
But if your answer is no, then you need to think again is what we're looking at, or you should. You should think again about it.
Yes.
Okay.
And you know, if I could have shown the video about the school dance, one of the points the mother is making to the media is, do you understand that when you're telling my 11-year-old daughter that she cannot refuse a dance, that you're telling her that she cannot say no to things that she would rather not do, right? And the mother gets that. It is very bad messaging.
I even tell people, I'm sorry, but I even tell people directly, if I ask them if they want to do something, anyone, man, woman, I don't care, I tell them, if you say no, that is fine with me. I do not really care. I mean, I care, but if you say no, I am not hurt, and you can say no.
Yeah.
Because my family has always taught me that when people say no, that means no. So.
Here's the thing, though. Women are conditioned to not say no.
I
so
know.
It's like it's not super helpful.
I know, but I'm just trying to give people the message that I'm not going to be hurt if you tell me no thanks or you decline. It's not the end of the world. So, but I understand that too.
Sorry. Oh, so can we go Janelle and then Nora? Yeah.
Okay, so I have a two-part question. So the first one is, do you have any particular kind of response about when men use politeness as a manipulation tactic? And also the other question would be, what do you think about women who personally very much identify with wanting to be polite, and how that fits into the broader cultural structure?
So help me here, because when I start to answer your first question, I will totally forget your second question, I guarantee it. But can you give me an example what you mean in the first question?
Just like if you're having a conversation with a man and they're not listening to your side of the argument, but then they're being polite as a way to be like, oh, I hear what you're saying, but like you're wrong, kind of a thing. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I follow. Okay. Am I missing something?
They're listening to your point, but they're not actually listening.
So they're listening politely.
Yes.
Is that what you mean? Oh, okay.
Like an artificial kind of politeness.
Like, thank you for your thought, but I'm still right.
Yeah, I mean, that's the funny thing about politeness is it's hard to tell when it's artificial and when it's authentic too, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that this is why these social scripts are so challenging to sort of resist, right? Because I think we often perform them without we're not being self-conscious about our performance of them, for one, right? So, but I think what you're asking though is like, is it being used as a tool to manipulate? Is that what you're is that what the question was originally about? Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about it a little bit more. Because I think in some ways, like, they're all tools of manipulation, right? And now, see, and I forgot your second question, so you have to ask it again.
So about like an individual woman's autonomy or agency to, if she's identifying with like these characteristics of being polite as like a part of her personality.
Yeah, so like what if you take your self-worth from
how does that
how
fit
you're
into
being
the bigger
polite,
structure?
right? Which I'm sure, so there are definitely like lots of times, right, where, or lots of examples of people who, they value politeness and they certainly take their self-worth from their good use of manners, right, and that they were raised, you know, with all these sort of trappings of politeness. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I sort of come back to my answer to the last question. I think that if people feel comfortable in acting politeness or the standards of politeness, go for it, right? I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, but I think that when we have instances where people are resisting, right, that script of politeness, that the only appropriate behavior is politeness, that's where it goes wrong, right?
I can see that having a very different effect when it's something like this kind of like sexual violence versus something that's like a microaggression too. It's like completely different.
Yeah, and what I see them on a spectrum, right? So if you're policing, I mean, I think, you know, so for example, if you find yourself in a, you know, a situation in which you've been accused of being impolite or not being nice enough or being too critical, I mean, inevitably that fills you with self-doubt, right? I mean, anybody then starts to go, wait, you know, am I too negative? Like, is something wrong with me? Oh my goodness. In part, you have that impulse because you've been taught, if you've been socialized as a woman, that your role is to make other people feel comfortable and happy and to be pleasing to other people, right? And so that moment where you get called out for basically resisting that gender socialization, it's hard not to sort of start that narrative of self-doubt in your head, right? But, you know, and those instances accumulate, right? They all accumulate into building this construct of passivity and a fear that if you resist in any way that there'll be judgments and punishments that come with the act of resistance. Does that, yeah, okay.
You didn't mention the Me Too movement at all, so I wanted to bring that in and ask you a question about that in politeness. I have been hearing about some things pretty close to home that have me a little bit distressed because I see evidence that the Me Too movement, where women are complaining about sexist treatment or harassment, has actually maybe made men so nervous that women are, it's creating a new kind of policing of women's complaints. I'm just thinking of a specific case that I've seen very close to home. And so I'm concerned that the Me Too movement, as wonderful it is, or I wonder if you would agree, I don't know if I agree yet either, that the Me Too movement can have this impact of making men so nervous that they then police women's complaints about sexism in a way that's kind of ratcheted up in its intensity. Do you see any evidence that that might be true? I've just seen one anecdotal evidence.
Do you mind sharing? But
I cannot talk about it, but okay. I would say that a woman that I know who had complained about the sexist behavior of somebody was retaliated against in a very, very problematic way. And my impression is that it had something to do with the Me Too movement, kind of putting men on notice and a little bit nervous that, you know, if anybody goes after me, that's not fair because.
So it sounds like what you're describing is this impulse. It sounds like there's now a impulse on the part of men to react instantaneously in a defensive manner. Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how if I can connect that to the question of politeness and impoliteness, I mean, within the Me Too movement itself, I mean, the whole Me Too movement is built on the fact that we're done being polite and quiet and silent and submissive and, you know, accommodating, right? So I think that in a sense that all of those things are tied up together. And I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that all of these things that I talked about are all happening at the same time that the Me Too movement is building up so much momentum. But I'd have to think a little bit more about other ways that they're connected. Yeah.
I guess what would be some social theories that would explain why women would police other women's, I guess, politeness?
So there's a couple concepts that you learn about when you study women's and gender studies or when you think about feminist theory. So one is this concept of horizontal hostility. And that is that, that's premised on the idea that girls and women are taught to, one, see other women as competitors, but also that you internalize misogyny. Right? So if there are ways in which we just internalize the messaging that women are less than, that they're, you know, and then we impose that on other women. So that's the one concept, is horizontal hostility. But I think some of it, though, too, comes back to Janelle's question, which is, I think for a lot of women and girls, they have been taught to develop a sense of self-worth that is built on, you know, this stereotype that you should be, or this gender role, that you should be nice and polite and pleasing and pretty and all of these things. And so they then police that in other women because it gives them a sense of the importance of their own self-worth. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah.
In your opinion, how rude can I be before I fear reprisal? Because just last week I was talking to a professor and a man interrupted us. And I thought it was very rude, but I did not speak up because you hear all the time about, like, when women refuse. I said, hey buddy, this isn't your business, and then he stalked me on Twitter. How rude can I be before I cross a line?
I can't answer that because I think it's very context specific, and I think I would just listen to my gut. But here's the funny thing is I've been noticing that in the stories I've been hearing more recently, I think that the women's marches of the past 2 years and the conversations that are happening around Me Too is I see more and more women who feel empowered to call out, particularly interruptions. So I've seen with my own eyes just recently several instances in which, and I never have seen this before, so that's what's striking about it, but in which I've seen some of my colleagues go, you just cut me off and I was not finished talking, right? I think, so I think people are re-examining these kind of scripts in ways that are maybe new, yeah. But I don't have like blanket advice for you, sorry. But, oh, sure.
In respect to the previous question on the Me Too movement, I don't wish to speak on behalf of any, entirety of the population at all. One of the things that I've seen coming from a different background from, I would think the majority of you, I don't know, but is that with the Me Too movement and the discussion of rape culture, specifically on college campuses, there is the assumption that men are always the aggressor. And so for a lot of men, there is a great concern for false accusation and cultural ostracization of them. There are people who have been forced off colleges because of a false accusation against them. And so there is definitely an increased concern, and I would believe certainly an increased backlash or attack against that. Not that that's acceptable in any rate, but I think there needs to be some more discussion and recognizing that issue as well.
Can I just jump in? Like, as I have 2 sons, and I am freaked out. That's what I tell them. I say, you have to watch out. You know, I don't, unfortunately don't have daughters, but yeah, I can absolutely see your point of view. I'm freaked out that they'll be accused of something.
For, you know, if any man places him in a position in which he is, you know, liable to make horrendously stupid decisions, he's setting himself up for that. So on both sides, men and women, at college parties, alcohol, drugs, both sides are setting themselves up in many cases for issues and problems and harm, whether, you know, any aggression is directly done or not. And then I would also like to ask, are you familiar with the concept of the non-aggression principle, that once somebody has committed a crime or an aggression against someone else, relative force is completely acceptable to defend oneself and one's property?
Yeah, but, and I mean, I think that, so essentially, Sharon Marcus's essay, so the name of the essay is actually called Fighting Words, Fighting Bodies. So she is very much looking at the ways in which, you know, women can, in fact, respond with aggression that goes against, of course, all of their socialization as a woman. But that's part of the rewriting of the script that she's asking to have done. But I think with regards to your first comment, I mean, I think, well, I don't really want to go into, because I'm not sure it's relevant to what I spoke about today, but the issue of, say, false accusations. I mean, there's lots of studies that have shown that, you know, well, there's a lot of worry about false accusations. They're rather insignificant in terms of statistics, right? And even if you look at, for example, the percentage of people accused of rape who actually spend any time incarcerated is like 3%, right? So the justice system works in your favor if you are ever accused of sexual assault. It's just statistically true. It works in your favor. But I think that this question, though, about boys, I mean, I think what we have is like this gap, right, where we have an older generation of men who are sort of socialized in a particular way. But right now we also have this sort of younger generation that could be socialized in a different way. And I think that, you know, for example, you know, when I grew up, it was common practice, you know, that if Uncle so-and-so wanted you to give him a hug, you would be rude as a 5-year-old to not go give Uncle so-and-so a hug, right? Where I think even today the narrative is to sort of push back against that, right? No, if a 5-year-old doesn't want to be physically hugged by her uncle, she has a right, and we should encourage her to say, no, I don't want to. And I think similarly, you know, when boys are young and they're, you know, not listening to their 5-year-old classmates say, no, I don't want to hug you. I don't want you to kiss me on my cheek. You know, we shouldn't react with, but boys will be boys, right? That's just, and he's just doing it because he likes you, right? That's just his way of showing that he likes you. I remember I got actually hit as a child with a lunchbox when a little boy tried to hug me. And the story in my family was, oh, but Richie just really likes you, right? And so that's the narrative. But I think people are pushing back against that. And that's exactly the socialization that young boys need to have now to avoid situations later, you know, when they're college students and whatever. So like the impulse to be scared for your sons. Well, I think teaching them early on, right, that, you know, that this person is not being rude to you because they don't want you to hug them or whatever, if that makes sense. I don't know. This is just the example that came to mind when you were talking. But. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming.